And Father Joe, feel free.
Good and loving God, we ask that you bless us this evening. We ask that you bless Kelly in her presentation. We ask that you send your spirit fresh upon us, kindle in us the fire of your love, and allow us to continue to walk, each of us individually and together as community, the path of penance and conversion in the Franciscan spirit. And we ask all these things through Christ our Lord. Amen.
All right, thank you, Father Joe, and thank you, Heather. So I'm going to talk tonight about penance, conversion, and creation and food, as Heather so aptly named this talk. And so that's my background is in studied food and nutrition, dietetics, as well as public health. So I've really come to integrate that with my understanding of Franciscan spirituality. So hopefully this will be enlightening. All right, next slide, Heather. So I took some of this from this piece, Fully Mature with the Fullness of Christ. And there's a chapter on penance that we read recently in my secular Franciscan fraternity for our ongoing formation for Lent. And I was really struck by it because it really speaks to just the understanding of penance as something positive. So it says, penance is not giving up something for Lent. It is not what you say and do after going to confession. It is not disciplining oneself or doing something hard to toughen up one's spirit, to make atonement for having done something wrong, or to assuage the feelings of guilt or shame. Penance is the conscious choice to respond to God's immense love discovered after a time of need and want by conforming to and committing oneself to Jesus's plan of healthy, growth-filled living on an ongoing basis. And so this is a bit of a different understanding of penance than we might usually think of, right? We think of penance as exactly that, giving up something. But this is saying, no, actually, penance is something positive. It's a response to God's love. And so I really like that, especially because I think it really aligns with our understanding of Franciscan joy, right? What is the joy that we seek to bring to the world, as brothers and sisters of penance? So I really appreciate this perspective. Next slide. So with this primary choice to respond to God's immense love come the additional choices of removing obstacles to healthy living, of supporting healthy living with the Eucharistic community, and of authenticating healthy living with works of charity. So, we have to break down, what does it mean by removing obstacles to healthy living? And this is not just for ourselves, but also for our neighbors. So we hear a lot of, when we look to spiritual enlightenment, we talk about removing obstacles. And this could be understanding the false self, and finding the true self. Like, who is it that God has really meant for us to be? How are we meant to be vessels of God's love? And what are the barriers to us doing that? Because if we were truly vessels of God's love, we would just be letting that love flow through us, and that love is part of creation. So what are all of the ways that we as a society have put up barriers to healthy living for ourselves and one another? And so I'm going to talk for a minute about some of the barriers to health and sustainability. So we have here social, environmental, commercial, and political determinants of health. These are different terms that we use in the field of public health. They're newer terms. Traditionally, people have spoken about social determinants of health. So that's like income, employment, housing, environment, education, access to healthcare. So these are all of the factors that lead someone to be healthy or not healthy. And there's disparities between communities in terms of who has access to a lot of these aspects that we need for our lives and who doesn't have that. And then there's been some new understanding of other determinants of health. So environmental determinants of health, like who is living near toxic dumps or concentrated animal feeding operations, and who doesn't, who has clean air, right? Who has access to good quality food. Then there's commercial determinants of health. So this is the influence of corporations, especially ones that market a lot of products that are not healthy for us. And then political determinants of health. So do people have access to voting? Go back. Yeah, so we have to think about all of these different factors in terms of understanding, do we and our neighbors have access to the factors that contribute to positive health? And these are all, these contribute to health disparities, especially in communities of color. Okay, next slide. So we have here different, again, some statistics about this lack of access to health. So Black Americans are 79% more likely to live where industrial pollution is highest. Black farm ownership has declined from 15 million acres in 1920 to 1 million acres in 2017. So there really is, there's big disparities here. And these environmental injustices disproportionately impact people of color, and just environmental injustices in general are barriers to healthy living that we have to be thinking about. Also, corporations have taken over the abilities of small farmers to maintain their land, and our food system has become increasingly industrialized and taken power away from small farmers and farmers of color. And we also have a food industry that has 60% is ultra processed foods. So we're not really supporting a lot of farm fresh foods going directly to consumers. We're supporting a food industry that is very processed. And a lot of that is going to the food companies because they want to process the food so that they can make more money. The food companies don't make as much money if the food were to go directly from the farmers to the people, then the farmers would be making more money. So this is the system that we have, and it's contributing to a lot of diseases, especially in the US. All right, next slide. So we also have the issue of how food production impacts climate change. So livestock production is responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is more than all the cars, planes, and trains on the planet. Processing, packaging, transporting, refrigeration, and retail account for another 15 to 20%, leading the industrial food system to account for about half of all greenhouse gas emissions. And deforestation decreases our ability to absorb carbon dioxide and decreases biodiversity. And 15% of the Amazon has been lost since 1970, with 65% of that loss attributed to cattle ranching. I've even seen higher numbers, like 80, 90% of this deforestation being attributed to cattle ranching. And this is a huge issue because that directly connects our diets to deforestation. So I think that's something that we all have to seriously take a look at. Next slide. So this image is from the Eat Lancet report, which was the first full scientific review of what constitutes a healthy diet for a sustainable food system and what can be done to speed up food system transformation. So it's the first attempt to set universal scientific targets for the food system that apply to all people on the planet. And the report breaks down how are we faring in different continents across the world. How are we doing in terms of having a sustainable food system? And as you can see here for North America, we're not doing so well. We have 638% is the the percentage of our red meat intake compared to what it should be for a sustainable diet. Starchy vegetables is over 170%. Our egg consumption is over 260%, I think. Poultry over 200%, and dairy is over 145%. So, and then, you know, we're not having enough of the fruits and the vegetables, fish, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. Like, those are the healthy things that we're not having enough of. So our diet in the US and North America is disproportionately unsustainable. Next slide. So I was really struck, I heard this quote recently. It was actually on a Catholic Climate Covenant webinar for young adults. And it really struck me because I felt that it was speaking to my particular weaknesses, that the external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. So, you know, how can we build up our internal abilities to, to contemplate these issues so that we're not growing our internal, we're not expanding our internal deserts, we're not devoid of, letting God flow through us, right? Because that's going to directly contribute to the external deserts in the world growing. If we are better stewards of, the creation that God has given to us for that to be something that we bring to the world, and we're able to foster that within ourselves. If we're able to say, how is it that we are removing those barriers to God's love? That's this definition of penance, that will allow us to better foster creation, to make sure that we're not expanding the external deserts of the world. So I think it's a very important quote. All right, next slide. So this is a quote I always like to use from the Care for Creation of Franciscan Spirituality of the Earth. It's about food and penance. It says, eating locally is good for our health and the health of the planet. It is good for local farmers. It builds community and contributes significantly to curbing global warming. It is the perfect penitent action, requiring intention and sacrifice on the personal level, offering transformative potential on the societal level, and in the meantime, bringing into our lives many of the spiritual gifts that accompany the penitent life: simplicity, community, humility, and joy. And, I always liked this quote, but then when I came across this new definition of penance, I said, well, how can we make this even more positive? How can we, instead of looking at eating locally as having to give something up, what if we looked at it from a different paradigm, that of recognizing and celebrating the abundance that God has provided for us? What if we looked at the world through the lens of St. Francis, who praised God for every element of creation and found joy in biodiversity and nature and the opportunity that we have been given to be alive and to be nurtured from this creation? So, I'm trying to, think about how can we make this the penance, right? So it's not just something that we're giving up, that we're sacrificing, but how can we look at the joy that can come from just being grateful for the food that's around us in our local communities that we can be supporting. Next slide. So going back to fully mature with the fullness of Christ, it says, penance is primarily a positive experience, choosing spiritual health, whole soul, mental health, whole mind, emotional health, whole heart, physical health, whole strength, and social health, loving neighbor as self, as the way of returning the love God has bestowed upon us. It is setting oneself on a 5-point program of daily living which fulfills God's plan for a healthy, productive, stimulating, creative love life with God. So this to me is an encouraging message. Isn't it liberating to know that penance is about finding our true self so that we and others can flourish as God intended? Next slide. And it says, the first step of a response in fulfilling a life of penance in the Franciscan tradition is to choose life, to choose the health or the growth of the lifestyle that is the plan of our loving God for us, and thereby is the productive means for us to return the love God has showered upon us. So this is important for us as Catholics in terms of having like a whole life approach, and how can we have that in our daily interactions? It's not just about supporting women in childbirth or stopping the death penalty or even advocating to prevent further man-made climate change. It's about finding the way of living that we are meant to have in our daily lives, that God has uniquely chosen for each of us individually, and that we're responsive in the moment. So once we see the inequities around us, once we see what are those barriers to healthy living in ourselves and those around us, how can we remove those barriers so that everyone can live more fully? That's what choosing life is about. All right, next slide. So again, from the fully mature section, wellness is a choice. So it's a decision that you make to move toward optimal health. It's a way of life, a lifestyle you design to achieve your highest potential for well-being, a process developing awareness that there's no endpoint, but that health and happiness are possible in each moment, here and now. It's an efficient channeling of energy. So energy received from the environment, transformed within you, and sent on to affect the world outside. That's an important one, I think, in terms of how are we channeling our energy so that it's a positive, transformation. So the next one is the integration of body, mind, and spirit, the appreciation that everything you do and think and feel and believe has an impact on your state of health, and the loving acceptance of ourselves. So how much would it change our penitential and Lenten practices if we were to think about the path to wellness so that we can become more of the vessel of Christ's love that God has intended for us? Many people encounter obstacles to health that are caused by policies that allow for environmental pollution, industrialized food supply with high amounts of ultra-processed foods, food insecurity rates, insufficient support for regenerative agriculture, income inequalities, poor housing, and systemic racism, to name a few of the injustices. So as we transform ourselves during Lent, maybe find new ways to remove the obstacles to healthy living for our fellow brothers and sisters. All right, next slide. And so going to Laudato Si from Pope Francis, he says, since everything is closely interrelated and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, I suggest that we now consider some elements of an integral ecology, one which clearly respects its human and social dimensions. So Laudato Si is very much about looking at the intersection of the ecological crisis and the social crisis of humanity, and what are those areas of intersection. So it's very much, again, it says, respects the human and social dimensions. So the integral ecology necessarily looks at our role as human beings within the larger world. It looks at, as St. Francis did, seeing himself as kin with creation. We're all part of the environment around us, and we have to act that way. All right, next slide. So today is International Women's Day, and I wanted to take a moment to recognize that and to let you know about some different opportunities here. So this is the slide from Wanda. So this is Tambra Stevenson's organization, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. And I put this up. I like, I think that she's doing wonderful work in transforming, the younger generation to be involved with creating more sustainable and culturally relevant food systems. And I also just wanted to point this out as well, because addressing gender inequality is essential to achieving sustainability in agriculture. And educating girls actually can have a really big impact on the environment. So there's something called Project Drawdown, which it measures the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent that can be reduced or sequestered from different environmental activities. And educating girls could actually save 85 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's pretty powerful. And it says, education shores up resilience and equips girls and women to face the impacts of climate change. They can be more effective stewards of the food, soil, trees, and water, even as nature cycles change. They have greater capacity to cope with shocks from natural disasters and extreme weather events. So it's important that we recognize the need for doing more education of girls and women and supporting them in agriculture. Next slide. So in terms of something practical that we can do in terms of changing our food habits to be more sustainable, this is the grow method from Oxfam. It's a couple years old, but I think I like it because I think it's very simple. You know, there's these 5 steps here. So save food, so make sure that we don't waste food, right? Eat seasonally, so we're not transporting food from all over different parts of the world. You know, if we eat seasonally, we're also eating more locally, eating less meat, because meat has a huge impact on the environment, supporting small scale farmers, as opposed to the large, monopoly food industry, and then cooking smart, so using less energy when we cook. And I think this is a very simple way to think about how can we make sure that we're eating sustainably and healthfully, and keeping in mind all those across the world who are struggling with a changing environment that's making it more difficult to grow food, and just not having enough food many times. So this can bring more equity to our food system. Next slide. So this is a map through Soulfire Farm. They are a farm of Black farmers in upstate New York, and they've created this reparations map, which they call it. And they have different farmers across the country, different Black Indigenous farmers who are really looking to build out their capacity to farm on the land. And so you can go on this website. It's a soulfirefarm.org. The link is there at the bottom, and find, there might be farmers near you that you can be supporting through this network. So I wanted to make you aware of that. There's also the Black Church Food Security Network, which is largely in the Baltimore area, but I think they've also been expanding along different parts of the Northeast coast. Okay, next slide. And so this is the good food purchasing policy through the Center for Good Food Purchasing. And there's these 5 different value categories. And the idea behind this is it's a policy that local municipalities can adopt that puts more ethics within the supply chain. So different cities, New York has been doing this, LA, Chicago, there's a number of different cities throughout the country that have started adopting this good food purchasing policy. So for the various different city agencies, they're really looking at these different components. So how are we supporting local economies, environmental sustainability, working conditions, animal welfare, and nutrition? And how are those guiding the purchasing behaviors of those large institutions and government agencies? So I think it could be really powerful to get involved with any of those efforts to bring this policy to different cities. Next slide. So going back to St. Francis, he heard this call, go rebuild my house, but it became much larger than him just repairing a small church. It became the entire oikos, or the entire world or common home, as he saw himself as kin with all of creation. And we can think of repairing the house of God as the earth and all of creation, as well as our own bodies. So how are our choices helping to build a more sustainable food system that increases food security for all and for future generations? Scientists estimated in 2014 that we only have 60 years of farming left if soil degradation continues, which is really scary. For someone, some of us in our lifetime, there might not be enough food because soil is being degraded at such a rapid pace. So, but meanwhile, we can regenerate the soil. We can sequester carbon back into the ground through regenerative agriculture. It just requires the will, of society and the political will for this to happen. But where can we start? We can start just in our own communities, loving our neighbor, or the people closest to us in our food supply. If we think about our food and, were the workers treated fairly who produced it, or were they exposed to toxic chemicals and pesticides that are contributing to environmental degradation and poor health? Do we know the farmers who grow our food? And the communities that, the food stores in our community, what kind of food supply are they supporting? Bonaventure described Francis as one who lived in the center of creation because he lived in relationship to Christ, the center. So Francis discovered that God is love and love requires relationship with another. If we love those closest to us and we consider the products that we consume in the world and how that impacts other people, it will bring us closer to Christ as well. Next slide. So just one more piece on St. Francis. I think this is all preaching to the choir, I'm sure, but just as a recap, we can look at Francis as an example of someone who prayed in nature and discovered more about God and himself through the practice of contemplative prayer in nature. He spent a third to half of each year praying in nature in the wilderness, living in hermitages, caves, under lean-tos on mountainsides, and he interspersed this with preaching. There was something about that experience of being intimately related to creation itself that helped him grow more fully into the mystery of God. And that's what we are desperately in need of today, because we are so alienated from the earth and from ourselves. And I've seen this really recently just through different people who have that Franciscan spirituality of the earth. So I've been leading a group of people going through Just Faith's new program, Sacred Land, Food and Farming. And as part of the program, we read the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And so she has this indigenous, she has Native American background to her, and she's also a botanist and ecologist. So, she's really comparing these together, and it's just such a beautifully written book, and she spends so much time talking about nature, in such an eloquent way that we can really come to see ourselves as, connected to creation the same way St. Francis did. And also I just watched a couple of movies about Jane Goodall, and, she came to be such an environmental activist because of how much time she spent outdoors in the wilderness in Africa with the chimpanzees, and that time in creation is what can really transform us to live more ecological lives the same way it did for St. Francis. So just wanted to leave you with that and to see if we have any questions. So thank you.